The millionaire was a man of many mysteries. Known to few and even less understood by those who knew him, he lived a life that defied the trappings of typical wealth. His name was Robert Sinclair, and despite his immense fortune, he avoided the extravagant lifestyle that often accompanied wealth. No lavish parties, no grand social gatherings, no philanthropy that made headlines, just silence and solitude in a sprawling mansion on the edge of town. The world outside saw him as a quiet, unremarkable figure, a man who might have been wealthy, but whose true wealth was hidden behind the walls of his grand estate. Sinclair had built his empire slowly, through investments in industries that no one would have suspected. A master at staying ahead of the market, he owned stocks in some of the most successful companies, but few knew the extent of his riches because of how well he masked them. He held his shares in blind trusts, lived without the fanfare that could attract attention, and avoided unnecessary publicity. When he appeared in public, which was rare, he did so with a degree of humility and simplicity that made people think he was just another older gentleman enjoying his retirement. His life was a paradox, immense wealth, cloaked in a veil of invisibility. As time passed, Sinclair withdrew even further from the public eye. His few remaining acquaintances noticed that he rarely left his mansion in the final years of his life. Instead, he spent most of his days in his study, surrounded by books and papers, poring over documents no one else saw. It wasn't that he was antisocial. He had just become accustomed to solitude, as if he had long made peace with the fact that money did not equate to happiness. The only person who truly knew him was Grace, his black maid who had worked for him for more than 2 decades. Unlike the fleeting assistants and employees who came and went, Grace remained a steady presence in his life. From the moment she started working at the mansion, she carried herself with quiet dignity, performing her duties without seeking acknowledgement. Her job was simple in its description but profound in its execution. She maintained the household, cooked his meals, and saw to his basic needs. But beyond the domestic responsibilities, there was an unspoken bond that formed between them. Grace was a woman in her mid-50s, and when she first began working for Sinclair, she was in her early 30s, a widow trying to make ends meet while raising 2 children on her own. The job had come at a time when she desperately needed stability, and for Sinclair, she provided a sense of reliability that he had long sought in his staff. Though their conversations were minimal and their exchanges mostly practical, a strange mutual understanding grew between them. Over the years, Grace became the only person he allowed into his life in any meaningful way, even if that meaning was never overtly expressed. Despite this quiet companionship, no one would have guessed the extent of their connection. Sinclair never mentioned Grace to his few business associates, and he certainly never introduced her to anyone in his distant family. In fact, his relatives hardly ever visited him, leaving him to live his life without the familial ties most people cling to. Grace, too, kept their relationship professional. She arrived on time each day, fulfilled her duties, and left without asking questions. But she always knew when Sinclair needed something before he asked for it. She could tell from the way he moved, the way his eyes lingered on a book or an unfinished letter, that he was wrestling with something. And though he rarely shared his burdens with her, Grace was always there to offer a quiet, comforting presence. As Sinclair aged, his health began to deteriorate. It was gradual at first, barely noticeable to anyone but Grace. She began taking on more responsibilities, quietly adjusting to his needs. She made sure his medications were taken on time, prepared meals that accommodated his dietary restrictions, and kept the house meticulously clean, all while maintaining a respectful distance. But over the years, her presence became more essential. Sinclair never explicitly said so, but Grace knew that without her, his life would have been much lonelier, much more difficult. Then one day, without warning, Robert Sinclair passed away. It was as if he had simply slipped out of life quietly, like he had lived it. There was no grand announcement, no emotional farewell. Grace found him in his study, slumped over in his favorite armchair, an unfinished letter on his desk. The room was still, the weight of the years, and the secrets Sinclair held now forever locked away. Grace stood there for a long moment, absorbing the reality of his passing. She felt a strange mix of sorrow and finality, but kept her composure, just as she always had. The authorities were called, the body was removed, and soon enough, the quiet mansion became even quieter. News of Sinclair's death spread quickly, mostly due to the curiosity surrounding his wealth. Journalists dug into his background, and old acquaintances came forward, recalling him as a private but decent man. Yet the mystery of his fortune remained. Who would inherit his vast estate? Many speculated that distant relatives whom he hadn't seen in years would be the natural heirs. They began to appear, making phone calls to his lawyer, circling like vultures around what they thought would be a large inheritance. But the true shock came during the reading of the will. It was a small gathering, just a few distant cousins and business representatives, along with Grace, who had been invited but didn't think much of it. She sat quietly in the back, assuming she was there simply to witness the proceedings. But as the lawyer began reading the document, the room quickly filled with stunned silence. To the disbelief of everyone present, Sinclair's entire fortune, his mansion, his investments, his bank accounts, was left to Grace, his maid. The will was clear and legally binding. The cousins, who had assumed they would walk away with a tidy sum, were left speechless. Not a penny went to them. Grace, the woman who had faithfully worked for him for more than 2 decades, was the sole heir to the millions Sinclair had amassed. Grace herself was in shock. She hadn't expected anything beyond maybe a small token of appreciation or a few months' salary to help her transition out of the job she had faithfully performed for years. But everything? The mansion? The wealth? The media caught wind of the story almost immediately. How could a reclusive millionaire leave his entire fortune to his maid? The press ran wild with speculation. Was there some scandalous relationship? Was Grace involved in some sort of manipulation? Some painted the story as one of justice, a humble woman being rewarded for her loyalty, while others were more cynical, assuming there had to be ulterior motives. Grace, however, was overwhelmed by the sudden attention. She had never sought the spotlight, nor did she have any desire for the life that now seemed to be thrust upon her. As reporters camped outside the mansion, and old friends and acquaintances came out of the woodwork to offer their congratulations, Grace remained resolute in her silence. She didn't have answers for them, only the truth that she had been as surprised as anyone else by Sinclair's decision. Yet despite the shock, there was a certain sense of justice in it all. Grace had been there, day in and day out, through Sinclair's lonely years, tending to his needs without complaint or expectation. While others had turned their backs on him, she had remained quietly fulfilling her duties with dignity and care. Perhaps Sinclair had recognized this in his final days. Maybe he had seen in Grace something that others had overlooked, a deep, unwavering loyalty that deserved recognition even if the world couldn't understand it. But now Grace faced a new reality, one that would bring its own set of challenges and revelations. The media frenzy that followed the reading of Robert Sinclair's will was unlike anything Grace had ever imagined. For most of her life, she had been an invisible figure, living quietly in the background, doing her job without any fuss or expectation of recognition. Now she was front and center in a story that captivated the public. Reporters were parked outside the mansion gates, photographers trying to catch glimpses of her whenever she stepped outside. The world wanted to know who she was, this humble maid who had suddenly become a millionaire overnight. And while Grace had always preferred to keep a low profile, that choice was no longer hers. As news outlets covered the story from every angle, speculations began to run wild. Grace's picture was splashed across headlines, often accompanied by sensationalist taglines like, "The maid who won the millionaire's fortune," or "Was there more to their relationship?" It didn't take long for some people to suggest that she must have manipulated the elderly Sinclair into leaving her his estate. After all, why would a man with such wealth leave it to his maid when there were distant relatives who could have inherited it? The public, hungry for scandal, latched on to the idea that something more sinister might be at play. Grace's life, which had once been defined by routine and privacy, was now turned upside down. Every day, journalists knocked on her door, asking for interviews or statements, while the phone rang incessantly with calls from media outlets and curious onlookers. Even the quiet grocery runs she used to make without a second thought were no longer possible without being followed by cameras. Her once peaceful existence was now a chaotic whirlwind of attention she neither wanted nor knew how to handle. In a way, the inheritance felt more like a burden than a blessing. But what truly shocked Grace was not just the media's relentless pursuit of her story, but the sudden outpouring of interest from people who had once been distant or absent altogether. Old acquaintances and even distant family members who had barely spoken to her in years suddenly resurfaced. They reached out with well wishes, offering their congratulations, but Grace could sense the ulterior motives behind their sudden warmth. Some of them hinted at financial troubles, subtly suggesting that they could use a bit of help now that she had come into money. Others outright asked her for loans or investments in dubious business ventures. Grace, who had always lived a modest life, found it difficult to navigate these newfound relationships. She had never been the type to flaunt wealth or power, and now she was being forced into a position where people expected her to do just that. The expectations weighed heavily on her shoulders. Should she help those who asked? Was it her responsibility to share this fortune, even with those who had never been there for her before? These were questions she had never anticipated needing to answer, and the stress of it all left her feeling isolated, despite being surrounded by so many people clamoring for her attention. As if the media scrutiny and sudden friends weren't enough, Grace also had to contend with the legal complications that came with inheriting such a vast estate. Although Sinclair's will had been clear, the process of transferring ownership of his assets was anything but simple. There were endless meetings with lawyers and financial advisors, all of whom spoke in terms and jargon Grace didn't fully understand. The complexity of managing millions in investments, properties, and trusts was overwhelming. Sinclair had built an empire of sorts, but he had never prepared Grace for the intricacies of what came with it. She felt like a fish out of water, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had been left to her. One of the most immediate challenges was the mansion itself. For years, Grace had cared for it meticulously, but now that it was hers, she found herself feeling out of place within its walls. The house, grand and stately, had always felt like a place of work to her. She knew every corner of it, every piece of furniture and every painting, but she had never imagined it as her home. And now, despite its beauty, it felt too big, too empty. She was alone in this massive estate, with no one to share it with, and the weight of its silence pressed down on her. The idea of living there, surrounded by the memories of Sinclair and the life she had once led, felt suffocating. Beyond the practical matters, Grace also struggled with the emotional toll of her new reality. The sudden shift from being a maid to a millionaire didn't just affect her financially, it upended her entire sense of self. For most of her life, Grace had defined herself by her work, by the routine of taking care of someone else's home and needs. Now, with all of that gone, she found herself questioning who she was without those roles. What did it mean to be wealthy? How should she live now? What would her purpose be? Her children, now grown and living their own lives, had been supportive, but even they were unsure of how to help their mother navigate this new chapter. They offered advice, telling her to embrace her good fortune and enjoy the opportunities it brought, but Grace found it difficult to let go of her modest habits. She still cooked her own meals, still cleaned parts of the house out of habit, even though she could now afford to hire an entire staff if she wanted to. The idea of indulging in the luxuries that were now available to her felt wrong somehow, as if she didn't deserve it. As time went on, the pressure mounted. The public's fascination with her story didn't fade as quickly as she had hoped, and the tabloids continued to print speculative articles about her. Some painted her as a modern-day Cinderella, a woman who had risen from obscurity to fortune. Others were more critical, continuing to question her integrity and the nature of her relationship with Sinclair. There were whispers of potential lawsuits from distant relatives, who claimed that they had been wrongfully excluded from the will. Though no one had yet come forward with a formal legal challenge, Grace knew it was only a matter of time before someone tried to contest her inheritance. Amidst the chaos, Grace found herself longing for the simplicity of her old life, despite its hardships. She missed the quiet routine of waking up each morning and knowing exactly what the day would bring. The wealth that was supposed to bring her security had instead brought uncertainty, and the fame that came with it made her feel more vulnerable than ever. She had always been a private person, and now every aspect of her life seemed to be under a microscope. But even in the midst of her doubts and anxieties, there were moments of clarity. Grace began to reflect on her years of service to Sinclair, thinking back to the quiet companionship they had shared, even if it was never explicitly acknowledged. She remembered the small gestures of trust he had shown her, the way he had left her in charge of important tasks, the quiet conversations they had in his study, where they would talk not about money or business, but about life, about her children, about the simple things that made up the fabric of their days. Perhaps, she realized, Sinclair had seen something in her that she had never fully seen in herself. He had left her his fortune not because he expected her to become something she wasn't, but because he had valued her for who she already was. Maybe in his own quiet way he had wanted to give her the opportunity to live a life free from the burdens she had carried for so long. And perhaps that was the greatest gift of all, not the money, but the chance to finally live on her own terms. As Grace wrestled with these thoughts, she began to think about what she truly wanted for her future. The fortune over didn't have to change who she was at her core. She didn't have to conform to the world's expectations a millionaire should be. Instead, she could use the wealth in a way that reflected her own values and the life she had lived. It wouldn't be easy, but slowly she started to consider how she might turn this unexpected inheritance not just for herself, but for the people around her. Grace's quiet struggle to adjust to her new life as a millionaire was soon interrupted by something she had feared from the moment the will was read: a legal challenge. Robert Sinclair's distant relatives, who had already expressed their shock and disappointment at being left out of the will, began to make their move. It started with subtle comments in the press, insinuating that Grace had somehow coerced or manipulated Sinclair in his final years. But soon it escalated into a full-blown legal battle. The relatives filed a lawsuit to contest the will, claiming that Sinclair had been of unsound mind when he made the decision to leave his entire estate to his maid. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the media, reigniting the frenzy that had barely started to die down. Headlines declared, "Family fights back," and Maid accused of manipulation in Millionaire's final days. Grace, who had already been struggling with the constant attention, found herself thrust back into the spotlight, this time in an even more uncomfortable position. Her integrity, her relationship with Sinclair, and even her own personal history were being called into question, and the pressure was unbearable. The relatives' argument was simple yet devastating in its implications. They claimed that Sinclair had been suffering from cognitive decline in the months leading up to his death, and that Grace had taken advantage of his vulnerability to ensure that she would inherit his fortune. They produced documents from doctors suggesting that Sinclair had been showing signs of forgetfulness and confusion, and they pointed to the fact that he had become increasingly reclusive in his later years as evidence that he was losing his grip on reality. They also alleged that Grace had isolated him from his family, keeping them away so that she could exert undue influence over him. Grace was heartbroken. She had spent more than 2 decades serving Sinclair faithfully, never asking for anything in return, and now she was being accused of something so vile, so cruel, that it seemed to twist everything about their relationship into a dark caricature. She knew the truth, that Sinclair had been sharp and clear-minded until the very end, that their relationship had been one of mutual respect and trust. But proving that in a court of law against the accusations of his own blood relatives was going to be an uphill battle. The legal proceedings were grueling. Grace was called to testify, and the relatives' lawyers were ruthless in their cross-examination. They asked her probing personal questions about her relationship with Sinclair, trying to imply that there had been something inappropriate between them. They questioned every detail of her life, her finances, her past employment, even her personal relationships with her children. They tried to paint a picture of a woman who had struggled financially for years and saw an opportunity to enrich herself by preying on an elderly, vulnerable man. Grace held her ground, though it wasn't easy. She answered each question with quiet dignity, refusing to be rattled by their insinuations. She explained, calmly and clearly, that her relationship with Sinclair had always been professional, built on mutual trust and respect. She had never asked for anything from him, and in fact, had been just as shocked as anyone when she found out that he had left her his fortune. But the strain of being under constant scrutiny took its toll. Grace, who had never sought attention or fame, now found herself in the center of a storm she couldn't escape. The court case dragged on for months with witnesses called from both sides. Sinclair's lawyers presented evidence to counter the relatives' claims, showing that Sinclair had been fully competent when he wrote his will. They brought in his personal doctor, who testified that while Sinclair had shown signs of aging, there was no evidence that he had been mentally unfit at the time the will was drafted. They also presented testimony from those who had known Sinclair well, including his financial advisors and longtime business associates, who all confirmed that Sinclair had been a man of sound mind and strong will, even in his later years. But the relatives were not easily deterred. They produced distant family members who claimed that Sinclair had always expressed a desire to keep his wealth in the family, and that his decision to leave everything to Grace was completely out of character. They argued that Grace had somehow manipulated him, perhaps subtly over the years, convincing him that she was the only one who truly cared for him while pushing his family away. The media ate it up, fueling speculation about Grace's role in Sinclair's life. Every time she appeared in court, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, trying to catch her off guard. Grace, exhausted and emotionally drained, felt like the walls were closing in. What made the situation even harder for Grace was the personal nature of the accusations. The distant relatives portrayed themselves as the victims of a cruel betrayal, framing Grace as an outsider who had taken something that rightfully belonged to them. They spoke about how hurt they were by Sinclair's decision, how they had expected to be included in his will, and had been blindsided by his decision to leave everything to a maid. Their lawyers argued that it was only natural for Sinclair's wealth to stay within the family, suggesting that it was strange and suspicious for him to leave his entire estate to someone with no blood connection to him. The emotional weight of the trial began to wear Grace down. She had always been a private person, and the idea that her personal life was now being dissected in public was deeply distressing. Even her children, who had initially been supportive, were struggling with the constant attention. They too had become targets of media speculation, with reporters digging into their pasts, trying to find any angle that would add fuel to the scandal. Grace felt guilty for putting them in the spotlight, even though she had never asked for any of this. As the trial wore on, Grace found herself questioning everything. Was she really entitled to the fortune Sinclair had left her? She had never thought of herself as someone who deserved such wealth. She had simply done her job day in and day out, never expecting anything more. Now the weight of the money, the estate, and the attention it brought seemed too much to bear. There were moments when she considered giving it all up, walking away from the legal fight just to regain some sense of peace and normalcy. But then, in the midst of her doubts, Grace remembered why she had stayed all those years. She had cared for Sinclair not because she expected a reward, but because she had grown to care for him as a person. Their bond had been built on trust and mutual respect, not manipulation. Sinclair had made his decision knowingly and deliberately, and Grace knew in her heart that he had wanted her to have the security that his fortune could provide. To give up now would be to betray the trust he had placed in her, and she wasn't willing to do that, no matter how difficult the fight became. The turning point in the trial came when Sinclair's lawyer introduced a key piece of evidence that no one had expected: a handwritten letter from Sinclair himself, addressed to Grace. The letter, found among his personal papers, had been written just a few months before his death, and in it, Sinclair expressed his gratitude for everything Grace had done for him over the years. He spoke of how much he valued her companionship, her loyalty, and her kindness, and how he knew that without her his final years would have been much lonelier. But most importantly, he made it clear that his decision to leave her his fortune had been entirely his own, and that it was a reflection of the deep trust he had placed in her. The letter was a bombshell in the courtroom. It was a powerful piece of evidence that showed not only Sinclair's clear state of mind, but also the deep emotional bond that had existed between him and Grace. The relatives' lawyers tried to dismiss it as sentimental ramblings, but it was clear that the letter had a profound impact on the judge. It was a personal, heartfelt testament to the relationship that had existed between Sinclair and Grace, and it countered the narrative of manipulation that the relatives had been pushing throughout the trial. In the end, the court ruled in Grace's favor. The judge found that there was no evidence to support the claim that Sinclair had been of unsound mind when he wrote his will, nor was there any proof that Grace had exerted undue influence over him. The will was upheld, and Grace was officially recognized as the rightful heir to Sinclair's estate. For Grace, the victory was bittersweet. While she was relieved that the legal battle was finally over, the emotional toll it had taken on her was immense. She had never wanted to be thrust into the spotlight, nor had she ever sought the fortune that had caused so much chaos in her life. But now that the legal fight was behind her, she could finally begin to think about the future, and what she would do with the legacy Sinclair had entrusted to her. The court's ruling in Grace's favor was a moment of relief, but it came at the end of a long, draining journey. As she sat in her now legally inherited mansion, she could feel the weight of the decision sinking in. It was over. No more court battles, no more accusations, no more cameras outside her door. But the victory was not as sweet as she had once imagined it might be. In the process, Grace had been forced to reevaluate everything she had thought about herself, her relationship with Robert Sinclair, and even the meaning of wealth itself. She was no longer just the woman who had worked quietly in the background. Now she was a public figure, a millionaire, and with that came both responsibility and opportunity. The first few weeks after the trial were strange for Grace. The mansion, always an imposing structure that she had once simply maintained, now felt both like a fortress and a prison. Its grand halls, tall ceilings, and luxurious rooms seemed hollow in a way they never had before. For years she had walked through these spaces with a sense of purpose, cleaning, organizing, making sure everything was perfect for Sinclair. Now, with him gone and the house hers, the silence was deafening. She had the option to hire a staff, to fill the house with people, but that wasn't who Grace was. The idea of others serving her the way she had once served made her uncomfortable. She wasn't someone who wanted to be waited on, even if she now had the means to afford it. With time, Grace began to contemplate the legacy she had inherited, not just the wealth, but what it represented. Sinclair had been a man who valued loyalty, hard work, and independence. He had lived his life according to those principles, and in leaving everything to Grace, he had made a statement about how he saw her. He hadn't given her this fortune to transform her into someone else. He had trusted her to be herself, to use the wealth in ways that aligned with her own values. The realization gave Grace a sense of clarity. She didn't have to change who she was or live according to the expectations others had of her, now that she was wealthy. She could forge her own path, one that honored the spirit of the man she had served and the woman she had always been. One of the first things Grace decided to do was to help those who had always been in her corner, starting with her family. For years, she had worked tirelessly to provide for her children, often sacrificing her own needs to ensure they had the best opportunities available. Now, with the financial means at her disposal, Grace was able to do for them what she had never been able to do before: secure their futures. She paid off her children's debts, helped them buy homes, and set up trust funds for her grandchildren. It was a joy for her to see the relief in their faces, knowing that they no longer had to struggle as she had. But Grace didn't stop there. Despite the accusations during the trial and the greed she had seen from some people, Grace knew that wealth could be a powerful tool for good. She began thinking about the communities she had come from, places where hardworking people like herself often struggled to make ends meet. She thought about the lack of opportunities for education, the poor housing conditions, and the limited access to health care. It wasn't lost on her that as a black woman she had faced her own set of challenges throughout life, and now, with the fortune she had inherited, she saw an opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of others who faced similar struggles. Grace decided to set up a foundation in Sinclair's name, dedicated to providing educational scholarships, funding housing projects, and supporting small businesses in underprivileged communities. It was a way for her to honor the man who had entrusted her with his fortune while also giving back in a way that felt meaningful to her. The foundation quickly gained attention, not just because of the wealth behind it, but because of its focus on communities that had long been overlooked. Grace herself remained largely behind the scenes, preferring to let the work of the foundation speak for itself. But those who knew her story couldn't help but be inspired by her generosity and vision. The foundation's impact was felt almost immediately. Young people who had never thought college was a possibility now had scholarships that covered their tuition. Families who had been living in rundown apartments were able to move into new, affordable housing. Small business owners who had struggled to get loans received grants that helped them expand their operations. In every case, Grace insisted that the aid be given with no strings attached, just as Sinclair had left his wealth to her freely. It was about empowering people, not controlling them. As the foundation grew, so did Grace's sense of purpose. She had never imagined herself as someone who would be running a charitable organization, but in many ways, it felt like a natural extension of the work she had always done. Her life had always been about service, and now she was simply serving on a larger scale. But unlike her years working quietly in Sinclair's mansion, this time she was in charge. She made the decisions, set the priorities, and determined how the money would be spent. It was an empowering experience, and it helped her regain a sense of control over her life, something that had been missing ever since the inheritance had thrust her into the spotlight. Yet even as Grace poured herself into the foundation and its projects, she didn't lose sight of the personal connections that had always grounded her. She remained close to her family, and despite the wealth, she kept her own life simple. She didn't buy expensive cars or designer clothes. She still cooked her own meals, still kept her home in order. The mansion, while grand, became a place where her family could gather, where holidays were celebrated, and where grandchildren ran through the halls with laughter. Grace had always valued the small, quiet moments of life, and she wasn't about to let wealth take that away from her. Despite the success of the foundation, Grace occasionally found herself reflecting on the difficult journey that had brought her here. The legal battles, the media scrutiny, the accusations. It had been a painful chapter, one that had tested her resilience in ways she had never expected. But through it all, she had remained true to herself, and in doing so, she had found a way to turn what had once felt like a burden into a blessing. The money, the mansion, the attention, it had all seemed overwhelming at first, but now she saw it as a tool she could use to make a positive impact. As the years passed, Grace's story became one of inspiration to many. The woman who had once been a quiet maid in a millionaire's mansion had become a force for good, using her unexpected fortune to change lives and uplift others. Her humility and grace in the face of immense pressure endeared her to people from all walks of life, and while the media eventually moved on to other stories, those who had followed her journey never forgot the lessons she had taught, that wealth does not define a person, that integrity and loyalty matter, and that even the most unexpected turns in life can lead to something beautiful. In the end, Grace had found her peace. She had learned to navigate the complexities of wealth without losing herself in the process. She had honored Sinclair's memory, not by living extravagantly, but by using the resources he had left her to build something meaningful. And perhaps most importantly, she had remained true to the values that had always guided her: hard work, kindness, and a commitment to helping others. The mansion may have been hers now, the wealth may have been hers to control, but at her core, Grace was still the same woman she had always been, a woman who found fulfillment not in riches, but in the simple, powerful act of service. Her legacy, much like the one Sinclair had left her, would live on long after she was gone. And in that legacy, Grace found a sense of contentment and purpose that no amount of money could ever buy.